I was sitting at the top of the stairs, trying to be inconspicuous, hiding behind the curve of the banister where the light from the kitchen couldn't reach me. But the sounds came clearly, as if I were standing right in the doorway, absorbing every word, every intonation, every pause that made my stomach clench. The voices from below were intertwined, interrupting each other, tangled like a bundle of wires from headphones tangled in a pocket. "Frank, she's my daughter." Mom's voice was shaky, brittle, and cautious, as if she were trying to walk barefoot through broken glass without making a sound. "Listen, Sheila," Frank exhaled with annoyance, and even from here I could imagine him frowning, looking at her from under his brows. "I didn't sign up for this. There are enough problems. This house is a mess. I'm trying to figure it all out, and you're cooking dinner like it's not the end of the world." The volume of his voice made me jump. He sounded like he had already lost the argument, but he stubbornly continued to fight. "Now I have a child of my own," he continued, without letting his mother get in, "and I need to think about him, not about this. This." "Say it." Mom's voice became quieter, smoother, but there was something inflammatory in it, something I hadn't heard before. "Not about that leech you put on us." Frank snorted, and I suddenly found it hard to breathe. "What is she anyway? Another mouth to feed? What difference does it make to me? I don't care about her. She's not my daughter, you know." Mom exhaled slowly. It was a long, sad exhale, filled with something heavy, something inevitable. "But where will she go?" I shrank, trying to make myself smaller, merge with the stairs, become invisible, because at that moment I didn't want to exist at all. Frank groaned, as if he was already tired of this conversation. "What about her aunt, sisters? This one is yours. The dead man, what's her name? Linda." "No," Mom shook her head. I knew it, even though I didn't see it. "Frank." "Sheila, my God," he snorted, and I felt his patience snapping like an overheated string. "You're always so soft. She's family, right? Let the family deal with this child." There was a muffled beep in the room, as someone dialed a number. I tensed, held my breath, because I understood that this call was deciding my fate. "Yes, hi, Linda, this is Frank." He spoke slowly, emotionlessly, as if discussing the weather. "Yes, I need a small favor. Well, no, not a health problem, but a problem with a child, Sheila's daughter." I squeezed my eyes shut and rested my forehead on my knees. "Yes, Polly." His voice was rough, impatient, as if he was in a hurry to get rid of a burden. "That's the thing. She's moving in with you." I didn't hear what Aunt Linda said, but Frank chuckled. "Don't worry, she's practically invisible. You won't even notice that she's there." Mom shuffled her feet, and I imagined her nervously twisting her fingers, as she always does when she doesn't know what to say. "Linda, this is Sheila. Yes, I know, but we're in a difficult situation, and I—" "Great," Aunt Linda's voice cut through the air, sharp, cold as a knife. "I'll take it. But Sheila, I'm not a charity. You'll keep sending me checks." I could almost see Mom flinching. Even from here, it's over. I got up slowly, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, like thuds against the door of an empty closet. Footsteps thundered towards the stairs. I rushed to my room, grabbed my travel bag. I don't even remember when I packed it, but it was here at the door, ready, as if I knew this day would come. Mom knocked, quietly, carefully. "Honey." She pushed the door open, and her face contorted so much that it hurt me. I already knew what she was going to say. "I'm sorry," she said. I clutched the bag tighter, clutching it as if my whole world was contained in this old, tattered piece of cloth. I looked around the room that was mine, absorbing every corner, every object, as if trying to leave them in my memory, so that I could mentally return here later, even if this place would no longer be in my life, even if it became something ghostly, distant, almost fictional. I clenched my teeth, clenched my fingers on the strap of my travel bag, and without looking back went out into the dim corridor. knowing that my mother was following me, soft and indecisive, like a shadow that did not dare to get too close, but also could not let go. I could hear her breathing behind me, its ragged, erratic rhythm, as if she wanted to say something, but could not find the words or was afraid that any word would become too fragile, would break between us before reaching the addressee. I didn't turn around. It was easier that way. When I walked out the door, the air felt unexpectedly fresh, but not because it was cold. Rather, because this air was not saturated with tension, it was not filled with the smell of cooking dinner, muffled voices, heavy sighs. It was empty and neutral, as if it meant nothing, as if it could belong to anyone. Aunt Linda was waiting on the porch, standing in her severe gray coat, with an expression on her face that promised nothing. She looked at me for a long time, appraisingly, slowly, and I almost felt like she was deciding for herself who I was, whether I fit into her calculated order or would become another problem she had to deal with. "So you're here, Polly," she finally said, her voice flat and hard, without a hint of warmth or interest. "Hi, Aunt Linda," I murmured, trying to keep my voice steady so it wouldn't betray everything I was feeling at that moment. "Don't just stand there," she said, waving her hand as if to ward off something superfluous. "Bring your things. But remember, I run a strict ship. You will follow my rules under my roof." She turned around and walked into the house without looking back, as if she was sure that I would follow her, that I had no other choice. And she was right. I stepped inside, and the first thought that flashed through my mind was that it was cold in here, not the way it is outside, but with some kind of special, watchful cold that seemed to be more than just the temperature. "Rule 1, said Linda, without turning around, heading towards the back of the house. "No shoes in the house. At the door. And don't you dare drag dirt. I keep it clean." I quickly took off my sneakers and set them down neatly, hoping that it would be the right thing to do. "Rule 2, she continued, counting off her fingers without slowing down. "The lights go out at 9 in the evening. I don't want you to stay up late for school. No talking on the phone, no flirting, no nonsense." "Okay," I whispered, feeling something shrink inside from this mechanical precision, from how easily she distributes the rules, as if they were the most important thing. "Rule 3, she stopped and turned to me, and her eyes flashed like glass. "Don't answer me, don't ask questions. Just do what you're told, quickly and without fuss." I nodded. Her house was like a museum. Everything was in its place. Nothing random. Nothing that would indicate that a person who breathes, laughs, and is sad lives here. The living room looked untouched. The furniture was hidden under plastic covers, and the air smelled clean and pungent, as if the house had been permanently sterilized. I caught her eye, and she immediately snapped her fingers. "They are for protection, not for sitting. God help me if I see even one crease." I just nodded again, resisting the urge to ask why there were sofas at all if you couldn't sit on them. I spent the next few days trying to become invisible, walking silently through the corridors, avoiding Linda's gaze, following her rules as faithfully as I could, knowing that any wrong step could be disastrous. But one day I stumbled. I spilled the milk, just a few drops on the kitchen counter. I grabbed a rag and wiped it off quickly, but apparently not fast enough, because a second later Linda appeared in the doorway, and her voice was cold as steel. "What is this puddle?" I lifted the cloth to show that everything was already clean. "I've already wiped it off," I tried to explain. "Do you think sorry and a rag will fix everything?" Her voice was like thunder before a storm. "Do you think I have the time and money to waste on your clumsiness?" "No, But she already waved her hand, interrupting me. "Your mother sent you here like I had nothing better to do. Even your own mother didn't want you, so why should I?" Her words hit home like sharp blades. I stood with my jaw clenched, swallowing the pain, because tears wouldn't have changed anything, and it was useless to argue. I already knew that Linda always had the last word. "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "You're right. It won't happen again because if something like this happens again, we'll have bigger problems." She looked at me intently. "Can you hear me?" I nodded. The dinner was silent. Linda didn't like it when people talked while eating. I chewed carefully, slowly, trying not to break the silence, trying to be as invisible as ever, wanting to just disappear into his room. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and every day was like the previous one, as if I was stuck in a gray, endless corridor where the same steps were repeated over and over again. And there was no end in sight, no exit, not even the slightest hint of something new that it could break this cycle, bring at least a drop of surprise, at least a shadow of change. Every morning began with the mechanical sound of the alarm clock, with the tense silence at breakfast, with Aunt Linda's icy glares that glared at me if I stayed in the bathroom for a minute longer, or left the cup on the table at the wrong angle. Every move was honed to automatism. Every mistake was met with a heavy sigh or a harsh remark that no longer hurt as much as before, but left behind invisible scars that I learned not to show. But something was different that day. I was sitting on the carpet in my room, in the one that looked more like an empty box than a real home, surrounded by faded wallpaper that was peeling off in the corners, as if the room itself was gradually getting tired of existing. There was no comfort, no warmth, no traces of life here, just a sterile neatness, as if I were just a temporary tenant, a random guest who would one day simply disappear without leaving a trace. Aunt Linda went to the store, leaving me alone, and it was that rare moment when the house, usually filled with her stern presence, suddenly seemed empty, almost free, as if the ropes that bound me had been loosened for a moment. My heart was racing as I sneaked into the living room and grabbed my cordless phone from the stand. I knew my mother's number by heart. I used to dial it without hesitation, to ask what to buy at the store, to complain about my homework, to complain about a spider that was too big to remove myself. Now my fingers were shaking as I pressed the familiar buttons, but my memory didn't let me down, and the phone rang. One long beep, second, third, fourth, and so she picked up the phone. Yes. I held the phone to my ear, afraid that if I hesitated for even a second, I just wouldn't be able to say anything. "Mom, it's me, Polly." The words escaped before my courage could evaporate. There was silence on the other end, a short breath, gasp. "What do you want?" Her voice was flat, cold, alien. I blinked, as if trying to make sure I hadn't misheard her, that it was indeed her voice, but there was something wrong with it, something I hadn't heard before. I miss you," I began, but she interrupted me before I could finish. "Don't call here anymore," she said shortly, and at the same moment the line clicked, leaving only a void. I stood clutching the phone, pressing it into my palm, as if I could squeeze at least one more word, at least one more sound out of it. It wasn't just rejection, it was final. "I hope it was important." Aunt Linda's voice came from behind her, cold and sharp as a winter draft. I shuddered, turned around, and the phone almost slipped out of my hands. "I just wanted to talk to her." My voice trembled, betraying everything I was trying to hide. Linda stepped closer, snatched the phone from my hand, and her eyes narrowed. "Do you think these calls are free?" "I'm sorry, I'll pay for it," I stammered, not understanding exactly how I could do it, but seizing any opportunity to fix the situation. She snorted. "Will you pay? With what? No, you've caused enough trouble already. I'm done with this." She was already dialing the number before I could open my mouth, and her voice, hard, almost cracking with annoyance, filled the silence. "Yes, Betty, prepare the room. She's coming to you." I barely had time to process her words, as I was already standing at the door with a bus ticket and a travel bag filled in a hurry. Get off, Linda said, and turned around without even waiting for me to leave. I boarded the bus, feeling as if something inside me had become blurred, like the lines in a painting that someone had smeared with a wet brush. I thought of my mother's voice. That tone I've never heard before. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, feeling the vibration from the engine, contrasting with the storm that was bubbling inside me. Grandma lived in a small town, a couple of hours away, in a house that, although old, seemed twice as cozy as Aunt Linda's icy kingdom. When the bus stopped, I saw her on the porch. She stood looking at me, her brows drawn together in worry, her face open, alive, filled with something I hadn't seen in so long. "Are you okay, Polly? What is it?" she asked as I walked up the steps. I shook my head. "Aunt Linda sent me away. Mom doesn't want to talk to me anymore." Grandma sighed, and then she just opened her arms to me. I stepped forward, and her warmth, her scent, her touch, it was like a lifeline that was suddenly thrown into the sea. "Families can be complicated," she muttered. "Come in. I'll make you some tea." I sank into a chair at her kitchen table, surrounded by the smell of cinnamon and apples, and felt the warmth of the room unfreeze my fingers, as if I had just begun to realize how cold I was. And suddenly, something complicated began to become clear. I realized that I had entered a completely different world as soon as I crossed the threshold of my grandmother's house. There was no sterile coldness like Aunt Linda's, no empty, lifeless rooms in which things were not there to be used, but just to be there. Grandma's house breathed, lived, and warmed. The walls were hung with photographs not of prim relatives with strained smiles, but of sprawling apple trees, golden fields, picturesque streams, and misty morning meadows. And from all these images there was something real, warm, and filled with history. Grandma was already in the kitchen when I entered, standing at the stove, stirring something in a heavy cast-iron skillet, and humming to herself some melody that I did not recognize. "Grandma, do you need help with anything?" I shouted, pulling the bag inside, but she waved her hand without losing her rhythm. "Just sit at the table. I'll cook something now." Her voice was a little hoarse, from the years spent on the farm, from the screams above the roar of tractors and horses, from the wind that blew through your lungs so that it seemed to be pulling all the words out of you. Now all she had to deal with was the creaking of the porch swing and the rattling of old pots, which only got heavier over time. The days changed so quickly that it took me a moment to realize when they turned into weeks, and then months. I adjusted to my grandmother's habits, getting up before dawn, helping with breakfast, going to school, coming back and helping around the house again, telling her about my days at dinner, sitting at lessons and going to bed when the clock was approaching 9. No frills, no drama. Still, it was easier for me to breathe here. One day, on a cold day, when the sun was setting, coloring the horizon in orange-pink tones, I was sitting on a swing on the veranda, hugging the chains with my hands, and looking absently into the distance, not thinking about anything in particular, just absorbing the silence that was not in my mother's house, was not in my mother's house. Aunt Linda. Grandma came out on the porch, looked at me, then sat down next to me, and the tree creaked softly under her. "Sunset always tells you something," she said softly, and I felt her looking at me, but I didn't turn my head. "Whatever it is," I muttered, not knowing what to say. Grandma wasn't one to beat around the bush. "You know you're not staying here forever, right?" I felt something inside me tense up. "Oh." She handed me some papers, neatly folded, smooth, as if they were brand new. "I went away and made it official," she said simply. "You're mine now, forever." I unfolded the documents, and the words guardianship and guardianship immediately flashed into my eyes. She really did it. "Why, Grandma?" There was genuine surprise in his voice. It seemed to me that she had taken on something too complicated, too burdensome. Grandma just chuckled. "Because you're my blood." She put her hand on her chest, where her heart was beating. "But blood is not the most important thing. The spirit is stronger. Remember, tenderness is under force." I knew that old saying of hers. She always said that when it was difficult for me, when I fell and broke my knees, when I got a bad grade for the first time and thought it was the end of the world. I didn't know what to say, because everything that was spinning in my head seemed too insignificant, didn't convey even half of what I was feeling. We sat in silence, listening to the swing creak and the sky darken. I let her words wrap around me like a blanket to wrap myself in when it gets cold. "Thank you, Grandma," I finally said. She grinned. "Don't thank me yet. You're going to be weeding tomorrow, so don't relax." Her tone was light, almost joking, but I knew she was serious. The days passed. It was my 16th birthday, and I suddenly realized that my grandmother's house was not just a shelter in which I could hide, but something more. It was the place where my new journey began. I felt like I wasn't just living here anymore. I start running. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing still. And this morning, when the sun had not yet risen above the horizon, Grandma kicked the edge of my bed. "Get up and sing, Doctor." I groaned, groping for the alarm clock, which hadn't even had time to ring. "Grandma." "Don't wait for the light," she said uncompromisingly. "Cows don't milk themselves." "We don't have cows," I muttered, pulling the blanket over my head. "But the patients won't heal themselves," she replied. I froze. She nodded, and there was something in her eyes that I couldn't help but see, even through the morning fog in my head. "You've always wanted to help people, haven't you?" I was silent. "Well, what are you waiting for?" she continued. "Start doing something already." I slowly sat up in bed. I didn't understand what it was yet, but something in me changed at that moment. The days in the hospital merged into a monotonous rhythm of white walls, sterile smells, beeping monitors, and echoing footsteps along the corridors, in which the echo of voices dissolved in tense anticipation. I got used to this world, to its impeccable accuracy, to the need to make decisions that could change someone's fate, to the feeling of fatigue that eventually became an integral part of me. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was living here, among these hospital corridors, and the house was just a place where I returned for a short time to catch my breath before plunging back into work. The day I returned, evening had already covered my grandmother's house with a soft, warm light. "How are you?" Her voice came from the side of the stove, where she was fiddling with something that gave off a scent that instantly reminded me of childhood, of safety, of evenings when I didn't have to rush anywhere. "Good, very good," I replied, going into the kitchen and turning on the water to wash my hands, watching her move easily around the kitchen, checking the readiness of the dish with her usual movements practiced over the years, deftly stirring with a spoon dripping thick sauce. "Dr. Klin allowed me to perform a small procedure," I added, trying to hide the excitement in my voice, but Grandma immediately caught it and turned to me, raising her eyebrows. "Right," she stretched out, still holding the spoon in her hand. "What was it like?" I grinned, realizing that I couldn't deceive her attentive gaze. "It's scary as hell," I admitted, "but I did it. Everything went well." She nodded, as if confirming something she had known for a long time. "Because you're made of this stuff," she said, putting the food on plates and setting them on the small kitchen table. "You earned your stripes today." "Ha, it looks like it is," I agreed, diving into dinner with gusto, feeling the warmth of home. Cooked food spread through my body after a long day, washing away the tension. After dinner, we went out on the porch, as we did many evenings, me with a textbook, Grandma with her knitting, and the night enveloped us in the sounds of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the soft clatter of her knitting needles, and the rustle of pages being turned by me. "Are you thinking about Ted? What is it?" she asked suddenly, and I flinched slightly without looking up from the book. "Ted. The first guy I ever brought home, which seemed like a lifetime ago, but it really hadn't been that long." "No," I said simply, without taking my eyes off the pages. "Relationships take time and energy," she said. I sighed, realizing where she was going. "I don't have any." "You find time for what's important," she countered. "Grandma, there is more to life than just work and study." "Maybe after my residency," I muttered, knowing full well that she was right, but not ready to admit it even to myself. She nodded, accepting my answer, but I knew she hadn't forgotten this conversation and would come back to it. "Just remember that life is short," she said softly. I smiled when I heard those words. I've heard them from her more than once. "Never forget that you have more to give than just being a good doctor," she added. "You have a heart that needs to be shared too." It was in this simple way that she kept me grounded, reminding me that there was a whole world beyond the hospital walls, and one day I would become a part of it. But that morning, when I realized something was wrong, it changed everything. Grandma skipped breakfast, for the third time in a row. "That's okay," she said, dismissing my concern. "But nothing doesn't make you pale and exhausted." "Nothing" speaks in a voice that shakes like an old barn in a storm. And then the results came. The news hit me like a brick. "It's cancer," the doctor said in a flat, emotionless voice, as if he hadn't said these words for the first time. I wasn't breathing. "I wish it was for someone else," I said, my voice breaking, and it seemed to me that the world around me was swaying slightly. "Are you serious?" I darted my gaze from the doctor to my grandmother, who was sitting quietly, as if she had known for a long time that this moment would come. "As serious as it can be," she replied, straightening her back, her chin as hard as if it had been carved out of stone. The battle was short and fierce, and all this time she never let me see her scared, until one quiet morning, when her breath slipped out of her like a last, barely audible sigh. When the house was empty, it was as if someone had dug out the middle and left me with only a shell. I went through the funeral like someone else accepting condolences, shaking hands, hearing a whisper. "She loved you as her own." They didn't understand. She wasn't like a mother to me. She was everything to me. After everyone had left, when the voices had died down, the footsteps had disappeared into silence, and the air in the house had become heavy and still, I remained standing, leaning against the cool marble, staring at the coffin, which looked too new, too shiny, too alien, as if it could not belong to her, could not be the last. The haven of a man who was everything to me. I didn't cry. The tears came at night when no one was around, when I was lying in the dark and I could hear the house creaking, as if I was going through her loss. But now, left alone, I just stood there, absorbing the coldness of the stone, the silence around me, the feeling of emptiness that seemed to settle in my chest forever. "I'll make you proud, Grandma," I whispered like before, when it was just me and her against the whole world. "I swear." And the next morning, I was already in the hospital. The sterile corridors, the smell of antiseptic, the flickering light of lamps, people walking at a brisk pace, the booming sounds of footsteps and muffled conversations. All this was familiar. It was all mine. I could have lost my grandmother, but I was going to save the others, keep going the way she would like. And when I was standing in the operating room, when my hands were firmly holding the scalpel, when my heart was beating smoothly, and my breathing remained deep and calm, I felt her power inside me. Every stitch was a promise. Every movement is a testament to her legacy, because her love didn't end the moment she took her last breath. She was here. The way I held the instruments, the way I looked into the eyes of the patients, The way I didn't let fear get the better of me. The love that pushed you forward, even when life was kicking you in the teeth. A love that made you straighten your shoulders, look ahead, and keep your head up, knowing that you've never been truly alone. And then, one lazy Sunday, the doorbell rang. I opened it, and there they stood. My mother, her husband, and Sarah, like some kind of twisted version of a family reunion, but without smiles, without tears of joy, without real warmth. "You have a share," Mom said without even saying hello, her eyes boring into me like a hawk's when it's stalking prey. "It's only fair. Half of them are ours by right." Her hand fluttered in the air like a bird trapped in a cage, which is desperately trying to get out, but continues to beat against the bars, not realizing that there is no way out. The stepfather just stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, his jaw muscle twitching, betraying irritation, impatience, hidden but ready to burst out anger. And Sarah. Sarah wasn't even looking at me. She was just mindlessly flipping through her phone, her face expressing nothing but boredom, as if everything that was happening had nothing to do with her. I couldn't help myself. The laughter came out on its own, short, harsh, bitter. "You, for what exactly?" I shook my head. "The last time I checked, you kicked me out when I was 11. Mom's eyes narrowed. "We've given you a roof over your head, fed you, clothed you. It's got to be worth something." "Were you fed? Dressed?" I crossed my arms, looking at her with the same expression I usually used when I looked at patients trying to lie to me about their symptoms. "It looks more like rations and cheap rags." "But Grandma," Mom said the word as if it were something dirty and unpleasant, "left you everything. And we," the stepfather took a step forward, "are here fighting." "Listen," his voice became low. He spoke slowly, as if I were a child who needed to explain everything. "Just give us what we deserve, and we can all get away from this peacefully." Anger rose inside me, hot, rushing, almost tearing my chest from the inside out. "Grandma didn't leave you a penny because she knew who you were." Mom's face was blotchy. The stepfather narrowed his eyes, and Sarah finally looked up from her phone. "What does she say, Mom?" Mom swallowed nervously. "She says we won't get a damn thing," my stepfather said, and his face darkened like the sky before a hurricane. I nodded. "It's true. You won't get anything from me." His face contorted. "You're going to regret this," he growled, and a vein bulged in his neck. I stepped back, bracing my shoulder against the door frame. The morning sun warmed my back. "Is that a threat?" I asked, and my voice was steely, even if everything inside was clenched. He straightened his shoulders, but I wasn't 11 anymore. I wasn't afraid anymore. "It's a promise," he said. Mom grabbed his hand, her fingers clutching at him as if she was afraid he would rush forward. "Let's go," she hissed, her gaze cold, hard, filled with such fury that it seemed milk could turn sour. I watched as they turned around and left, as Sarah, without once looking at me, followed them, as their figures disappeared around the corner of the street, leaving behind only a trace of resentment, greed, and something else, something sticky, unpleasant, something that she knew she might come back one day. I stepped back inside and closed the door. The click of the latch was unexpectedly loud in the empty house, where my grandmother was no longer there, but in which her presence, her care, her voice still lived, sounding somewhere inside me, in those corners of my soul where the most important memories are formed. She left me more than money, more than possessions, more than walls and furniture. She left me the strength, the ability to resist those who once tried to take everything from me, who decided that I was not important enough to fight for my place in this world, who thought that I will silently accept everything they have imposed on me. She left me with a sense of self-worth, and I knew that no one could take it away from me now. The neighbors informed me with a quick call, the shortest signal that meant trouble was coming, And there was not only concern in their voices, but also impatience. They always loved good gossip, and this promised to be one of those stories that would be retold on the porches on long summer evenings. "I just thought you should know," Mr. Hopkins said, his voice a little muffled, but there was a distinct wariness in it. I asked, even though I already knew the answer in advance, feeling a familiar heaviness rising inside. "Your mother and her people," he hesitated, as if he didn't know how to choose the words. "We set up camp in your grandmother's old house." I closed my eyes, clutching the phone in my hand. This house was mine, and only mine. Grandma took care of it, knowing that they would come back, knowing that they would try to get what they wanted, knowing that I would have to face them and defend my right to this house, to my life, to everything that they once tried to take away from me. They had incredible audacity to think that they could just move in, as if no one would tell me about it, as if I wouldn't come, demand that they leave, and throw everything that had been accumulating inside me for many years in their face. I drove up to the house and got out of the car, feeling anger slowly spreading through my veins. "Hey, guys," I knocked on the door loudly, harder than I should have. "You can't just barge in here. This is not a motel." The door opened almost instantly, and Mom appeared on the threshold. Her face lit up with a fake smile. Her eyes sparkled with the same predatory gleam as always when she felt she could benefit. "Polly, we're a family," she exclaimed, leaning against the door frame, as if this house really belonged to her, as if she had the slightest right to be here. Her stepfather loomed behind her. His expression was much less friendly. He looked at me with displeasure, with impatience, with irritation, like a man who is used to everything going the way he wants, and who does not like it when someone dares to disagree with it. "We're not going anywhere," he said, crossing his arms over his chest, his smirk smug and his voice confident, as if he already knew I couldn't kick them out. "It's as much ours as it is yours." I felt rage rising in me. Clenching my fists, I felt the weight of the keys in my pocket, a small metal symbol that they were wrong, that this place belonged to me, that their days in this house were numbered. "This house is legally mine," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You have one day to get out or I'll call the police." They laughed. The kind of laugh that gets on your nerves, that makes you clench your fists until your knuckles turn white, that seems to say, "There's nothing you can do." "Yes, of course," my stepfather snorted. "Call the police on your own family. It will look just great." I stared at him, not blinking, not moving, not letting the words start doubts in my head. I didn't want a scene, but they didn't give me a choice. The next morning, when I arrived at the house again, they were still there, hanging around the yard, sitting on the porch like their owners, as if no one could force them to leave. That's when I made the call. When the police arrived, the air seemed to be filled with electricity, and I stood with my arms crossed over my chest, looking out the living room window, watching their expressions slowly but inexorably change. "Ma'am, sir," the officer's voice was firm, professional. "You need to leave the premises immediately." I saw my mother trying to say something, her face changing, despair appearing in her eyes. "But she's my daughter," she exclaimed, trying to seize the last chance. "And I'm her stepfather," Jared interjected, and his jaw twitched again, as it always did when he was angry. "It doesn't matter," the second officer said calmly, stepping forward. "You don't own this house, and the owner demands that you leave." Silence. And then I saw the realization slowly but surely flash across their faces. They can no longer just take what they want. They can no longer go through life, leaving ruins in their wake. They can't dictate the rules to me anymore. I didn't move until their car disappeared around the bend, until they disappeared, until the air became cleaner, lighter, freer. I turned to face the empty house. And it really felt like taking a deep breath after being underwater for too long. Silence, but not the empty, oppressive silence that filled the house after Grandma's death. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes when a storm finally passes, leaving behind a clear, clear sky. I stepped inside, and the air felt different, light and light. I no longer heard my grandmother's voice echoing in these walls, because now it sounded inside me. I made coffee, and its aroma filled the house, becoming that invisible bridge that connected me to this place, to my memories, to my grandmother, to that part of me that will always belong to her. Sitting at the kitchen table, I raised my cup and said softly, "To a new day. For justice, for freedom,